Marcus, your mother tried to attack me with a kitchen knife. Those were the words that shattered my world and turned my own son against me. I'm sitting here today, 3 months later, still trying to process how quickly my life unraveled because of one woman's lies. My name is Patricia Williams, and for 68 years, I thought I understood people. I raised 4 children as a single mother after my husband died in a factory accident when I was 32. I worked double shifts at the textile mill to keep food on the table and somehow managed to send all my kids to college. Marcus was my youngest, my baby, and the one who always promised he'd take care of me when I got older. He kept that promise, or so I thought, until Stephanie came into our lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I never liked Stephanie from the moment Marcus brought her home 2 years ago. Call it mother's intuition, but something about her smile never reached her eyes. She was 35, 12 years younger than my son, with platinum blonde hair that looked expensive, and a wardrobe that made me wonder how she afforded designer clothes on a retail manager's salary. Marcus was completely smitten. He'd been divorced for 5 years and hadn't dated anyone seriously since his ex-wife left him for her personal trainer. When Stephanie showed interest in this gentle, hardworking electrician who owned his own small business, he was over the moon. "Mom, she's amazing," he told me during one of our weekly dinners at Rosie's diner in downtown Burlington, Vermont. "She actually listens when I talk about work. She asks questions about electrical systems like she really cares." I watched him light up as he described her, and my heart ached because I recognized the look. It was the same expression he'd had as a little boy when he talked about Christmas morning, or the first time he caught a fish with his grandfather. Stephanie joined us for dinner the following week, sliding into the booth beside Marcus with practiced grace. She wore a black cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget and smiled at me with perfectly white teeth. "Mrs. Williams, Marcus talks about you constantly. He's so proud of how you raised 4 children all by yourself." Her voice was smooth as honey, but there was something calculating in her green eyes that made me shift uncomfortably in my seat. Throughout dinner, Stephanie asked all the right questions about my other children, my work at the mill before I retired, and my hobbies. She laughed at my stories and complimented my advice about relationships. By the time we finished our apple pie, Marcus was beaming like she'd just passed some crucial test. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been studied rather than gotten to know. Over the next few months, Stephanie slowly inserted herself into every aspect of Marcus's life. She redecorated his apartment, choosing modern furniture that looked beautiful but felt cold and impersonal. She convinced him to join an expensive gym where they could work out together, even though he'd been perfectly happy jogging around the neighborhood. Most importantly, she began subtly criticizing our weekly dinner tradition. "Marcus, you're 47 years old," I overheard her saying during one of my visits. "Don't you think having dinner with your mother every single week is a bit much? What happens when we want to travel or make other plans?" She said it sweetly, like she was just looking out for his best interests, but I saw the way her jaw tightened when Marcus defended our tradition. Our dinners became bi-weekly, then monthly, then occasional. Marcus always apologized profusely when he had to cancel, explaining that Stephanie had planned something special or they had couple friends to see. I tried to be understanding because I wanted my son to be happy, but each cancellation felt like another small death of our relationship. The first real warning sign came during Christmas dinner at my house. I'd spent 3 days preparing all of Marcus's favorite foods, just like I had every year since he was born. My other children, Sarah, David, and Jennifer, had driven in from Boston, Portland, and Montreal with their families. It was chaos in the best possible way, with grandchildren running around, multiple conversations happening at once, and the warm smell of turkey and cinnamon rolls filling every room. Stephanie sat through the entire celebration like she was observing a foreign culture. She picked at her food, claiming she was watching her carbs, and checked her phone constantly. When my grandson Tyler accidentally spilled grape juice on her white pants, she snapped at him with such venom that the entire room went silent. "Watch where you're going. These pants cost $300. Tyler, who was only 6, burst into tears and ran to his mother. Marcus immediately jumped to Stephanie's defense. "Mom, Tyler should be more careful around adults." Stephanie has every right to be upset. But I saw the embarrassment in his eyes, the way he couldn't quite meet my gaze when he said it. This wasn't the Marcus I'd raised, the man who'd spent hours teaching his nephew to ride a bike and never raised his voice at children. After everyone left, I found Marcus and Stephanie in the kitchen loading dishes into the dishwasher. I tried to address the incident gently. "Sweetheart, Tyler's just a little boy. He didn't mean to spill anything." Stephanie's head snapped up like I'd insulted her personally. "Patricia, with all due respect, children need to learn consequences. In my family, we taught kids to be responsible for their actions. In my family," I replied carefully, "we teach children that accidents happen and adults handle them with grace." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Stephanie straightened to her full height, which was considerable in her 4-inch heels, and gave me a look that could have frozen hell over. "Maybe that's why Marcus struggled so much with personal responsibility after his divorce," she said sweetly. "Sometimes too much coddling as a child can create problems in adulthood." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd spent 15 years helping Marcus through his divorce, watching him rebuild his self-esteem and his business. The idea that my parenting had somehow damaged him was so cruel and so wrong that I couldn't even respond. Marcus shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. He didn't defend me or challenge her assessment. He just continued loading glasses into the dishwasher like the most important conversation of our relationship wasn't happening 3 feet away from him. That night marked the beginning of what I now recognize as a systematic campaign to turn Marcus against me. Stephanie was too smart to make dramatic accusations or obvious demands. Instead, she worked like water, wearing away stone, one tiny criticism at a time. She'd mention how exhausted Marcus looked after our phone conversations, suggesting that I was burdening him with my problems. When I invited them over for Sunday dinner, she'd develop mysterious headaches or important work obligations at the last minute. When Marcus would relay stories about his childhood, she'd make comments about how different things were in healthy families, where children learned independence earlier. Most insidiously, she began reframing my expressions of love as signs of unhealthy attachment. When I brought over homemade soup during Marcus's bout with the flu, she told him it was concerning that I felt the need to baby a grown man. When I called to check on him after a difficult day at work, she suggested that normal mothers gave their adult sons space to handle their own problems. By their first anniversary, Marcus was a different person around me. Our conversations became stilted and formal, like he was worried about saying something wrong. He stopped sharing details about his work or his feelings, giving me generic updates that told me nothing about his actual life. When I tried to address the change directly, he became defensive. "Mom, Stephanie thinks you might be having trouble accepting that I'm in a serious relationship," he said during one particularly awkward lunch. "She's worried that you see her as competition for my attention." The words sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced them in front of a mirror. "Marcus, I'm happy you found someone," I replied honestly. "I just miss my son. I feel like I barely know you anymore." He looked genuinely surprised by this, as if the distance between us had developed so gradually he hadn't noticed it himself. "We talk all the time, Mom." But we didn't, not really. We exchanged pleasantries and…
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Surface-level information, but the deep conversations that had been the foundation of our relationship for 47 years had disappeared entirely. The engagement announcement came via text message. Not a phone call, not a visit, just a photo of Stephanie's enormous diamond ring with the caption, "She said yes." I stared at my phone for 20 minutes, trying to process that my youngest child was getting married, and I'd learned about it the same way his casual acquaintances had. When I called to congratulate them, Stephanie answered Marcus's phone with a breathless excitement that felt performative. "Patricia, we're so happy! We wanted to tell everyone at once. You know how it is." But I knew that wasn't true. Sarah had texted me that Marcus had called her personally to share the news, spending 20 minutes on the phone describing the proposal and his plans for the wedding. I was being deliberately excluded from the inner circle of my son's life, and the realization hit me like a truck. This wasn't about Stephanie wanting privacy or Marcus being busy. This was about erasing me from the picture entirely. The wedding planning process confirmed my worst fears. Stephanie scheduled dress shopping, cake tasting, and venue tours during my work hours, then expressed regret that I couldn't participate due to my schedule conflicts. When I offered to pay for the flowers, a tradition in our family for the mother of the groom, she thanked me politely but explained they'd already made arrangements with a specific florist who was more aligned with their vision. I found myself relegated to the role of distant relative rather than mother of the groom. My opinions weren't sought on anything significant, and when I did offer input, it was dismissed with phrases like, "That's more traditional than what we're going for," or, "We want something that reflects our style as a couple." The wedding itself was beautiful in the way that magazine spreads are beautiful, perfect, polished, and completely devoid of warmth. I sat in the third row behind Stephanie's cousins, watching my youngest child promise his life to a woman who had systematically removed me from his world. During the reception, I spent most of the evening making small talk with distant relatives while Marcus and Stephanie held court with their younger friends. When I approached Marcus during the father-daughter dance to tell him how handsome he looked, Stephanie appeared at his elbow before he could respond. "Patricia, thank you so much for coming. Doesn't Marcus look amazing in his tuxedo? I picked it out myself." She said it like she deserved credit for his appearance, like I hadn't been the one who taught him how to tie a tie and iron his shirts. That night, lying alone in my bed, I cried for the relationship I'd lost and the future I saw stretching ahead of me. Marcus would have children someday, and Stephanie would control my access to them the same way she'd controlled my access to him. I would become the grandmother who sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts but remained on the periphery of their lives. What I didn't know was that Stephanie's control over Marcus was about to extend far beyond limiting my contact with him. What I couldn't have imagined was that she was building towards something much darker than simple family manipulation. The woman who had stolen my son's heart had secrets that would eventually destroy everything she'd worked so hard to create. 3 months after the wedding, Marcus called me with news that should have been joyful but felt ominous. "Mom, we're buying a house. A really nice place out on Maple Ridge Road with a big yard and 3 bedrooms. I congratulated him warmly, but privately wondered how a retail manager and a small business electrician could afford property in one of Burlington's most expensive neighborhoods. When I drove by the house a week later, my suspicions were confirmed. It was a sprawling colonial with professional landscaping and a 3-car garage, the kind of place that cost at least $400,000. Either Marcus's business was doing far better than I'd realized, or Stephanie had money sources she hadn't mentioned. I didn't voice my concerns because I'd learned that questioning anything about Stephanie's background or motivations would result in Marcus becoming defensive and cutting off communication entirely. Instead, I sent a housewarming gift and a card expressing my happiness for their new beginning. The house became another barrier between Marcus and me. It was 40 minutes from my apartment instead of 15, and Stephanie made it clear that drop-in visits weren't welcome. "We're really trying to establish our own routines as a married couple," she explained when I mentioned stopping by to see their new place. "Maybe we could schedule something for next month?" Next month became the month after, which became eventually, which became never. I saw my son's new home exactly twice in the first year they lived there, both times for carefully orchestrated dinner parties, where Stephanie controlled every aspect of the evening, from the menu to the conversation topics. During the second dinner party, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Marcus looked exhausted in a way that went beyond normal fatigue. His skin had a grayish pallor, and his hands shook slightly when he reached for his water glass. When I asked if he was feeling well, Stephanie answered before he could respond. "Marcus has been working so hard lately. You know how dedicated he is to providing for us. Sometimes I have to force him to slow down and take care of himself." She rubbed his shoulders affectionately, but I caught the way Marcus flinched slightly at her touch. Throughout the evening, I watched their interaction with growing unease. Stephanie monitored everything Marcus said, subtly redirecting conversations when he started sharing too much information about work or his feelings. When he mentioned being tired, she immediately suggested he might be coming down with something and should rest early. When he reached for a second glass of wine, she reminded him that alcohol didn't mix well with his new medication. "What medication?" I asked, alarmed. This was the first I'd heard of any health problems. Just something to help with stress and sleep, Marcus said vaguely. The doctor said it's pretty common for men my age. But when I pressed for details about which doctor or what specific medication, Stephanie changed the subject with practiced efficiency. That night, I lay awake worrying about my son's health and his marriage. Something was wrong, but I couldn't identify what it was beyond a mother's instinct that her child was in trouble. Marcus looked like a man under tremendous pressure, but whenever I tried to reach out, Stephanie created obstacles. My other children began expressing similar concerns during our monthly family video calls. Sarah mentioned that Marcus had declined their invitation to Thanksgiving, claiming he and Stephanie were starting their own traditions. David said Marcus had been unreachable for 2 weeks after promising to help with electrical work on his Portland restaurant. Jennifer reported that Marcus had missed their father's birthday memorial service, something he'd never done in the 23 years since Dad's death. Something's not right, Jennifer said during one particularly troubling call. Marcus might have gotten married, but he didn't stop being our brother. This isn't like him. We agreed to plan a surprise visit for Marcus's birthday, hoping to see him without Stephanie's constant presence and control. The birthday surprise turned into a disaster that changed everything. Sarah, David, and Jennifer drove to Vermont with their families, planning to show up at Marcus's house with cake and gifts. I was supposed to arrive separately, giving them time to reconnect before adding the complication of my strained relationship with Stephanie. What happened next still feels like a nightmare. According to Sarah, when they knocked on the door, Stephanie answered in a robe with her hair disheveled and panic in her eyes. She claimed Marcus was violently ill and couldn't see anyone, but they could hear him calling their names from somewhere inside the house. When David pushed past Stephanie to check on his brother, she became hysterical. "You can't go in there," she screamed. "He's dangerous when he's like this. He attacked me yesterday." She showed them scratches on her arms that she claimed Marcus had inflicted during what she called a psychotic episode. My children, confused and alarmed, retreated to their cars and called me immediately. "Mom, something's really wrong," Sarah told me through tears. Marcus sounded like he was in pain, but Stephanie wouldn't let us see him. She said he's been having violent outbursts and that we shouldn't be around him when he's unstable. I drove to Maple Ridge Road immediately, my heart pounding with fear for my son. When I arrived, the house was dark except for a single light in an upstairs window. I knocked repeatedly, but no one answered. I could hear movement inside, but the door remained locked. That night, I called the police for a wellness check, but Stephanie met the officers at the door with a composed explanation. Marcus was sleeping off a migraine, she told them. He'd been struggling with mental health issues lately, and sometimes became agitated when he didn't take his medication properly. The officers accepted her story and left without seeing Marcus. 2 days later, Marcus called me himself. His voice sounded hollow and strange, like he was reading from a script. "Mom, I'm sorry about the other night. Stephanie told me my brothers and sister came by. I wasn't feeling well, and I guess I scared everyone." "Marcus, what's wrong with you? You sounded like you were in pain." There was a long pause, and I could hear Stephanie's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. "I've been having some psychological problems, Mom. Stress from work, maybe some depression. The doctor says it might be related to childhood trauma, stuff I never dealt with properly." The words sounded foreign coming from his mouth, like he was repeating someone else's diagnosis. "What childhood trauma? Marcus, you had a happy childhood. You've never had psychological problems." But even as I said it, I could hear how defensive I sounded, like a mother refusing to accept her child's struggles. Stephanie thinks I might have repressed some memories. She's been helping me work through some issues with therapy and medication. The explanation felt rehearsed, but I didn't know how to challenge it without seeming like I was dismissing genuine mental health concerns. Over the following weeks, Marcus's calls became increasingly erratic. Sometimes he sounded normal, like the son I'd always known. Other times, his speech was slurred and his thoughts seemed scattered. He'd tell me the same story twice in one conversation, or forget important details about his work and family. Stephanie began joining our phone calls, ostensibly to help Marcus remember things or to clarify information he'd gotten confused. She spoke with the authority of someone managing a patient, explaining his symptoms and medication adjustments like she was his caregiver rather than his wife. "Patricia, I know this is hard for you to see," she said during one particularly disturbing call where Marcus had seemed completely disoriented. "Mental illness is difficult for families to accept, but Marcus is getting the help he needs. The most important thing is that he feels supported, not questioned or judged." The implication was clear. Questioning Marcus's condition or treatment was harmful to his recovery. Any attempt to express concern was reframed as denial or interference with his mental health care. I found myself trapped between wanting to help my son and being told that my help was actually hurting him. The final straw came 3 months later when Stephanie called me directly, something she'd never done before. Her voice was shaking with what sounded like genuine terror. "Patricia, I need you to know that Marcus is having a really serious episode. He's become paranoid and aggressive, and I'm scared for my safety." "What do you mean, aggressive?" My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear her response. "He tried to attack me with a kitchen knife this morning. He was screaming that I was poisoning him and trying to steal his money. Patricia, I think he might hurt himself or someone else. The doctor said this could happen if his condition deteriorates, but I never thought it would get this bad." I couldn't process what she was telling me. The Marcus I knew had never raised his voice at a woman, let alone threatened one with a weapon. But Stephanie was sobbing so convincingly, and her fear sounded so real, that I found myself believing her despite every instinct screaming that something was wrong. "Where is he now?" I asked, already reaching for my car keys. "I had to call the police. They took him to Burlington General for a psychiatric evaluation." "Patricia, I'm so sorry. I know this isn't the son you raised, but his illness has changed him completely. The doctor says he needs intensive treatment, probably long-term care. I drove to the hospital in a daze, trying to reconcile the loving son I'd raised with the dangerous man Stephanie described. When I arrived at the psychiatric unit, I was told that Marcus was sedated and couldn't have visitors until his condition stabilized. Dr. Reynolds, the attending psychiatrist, met with me briefly to explain Marcus's situation. According to Stephanie's report, Marcus had been experiencing increasing paranoia and delusions over several months. The knife incident was the culmination of escalating aggressive behavior that posed a danger to himself and others. "Mrs. Williams, I want you to understand that this type of rapid psychological deterioration is unusual but not unheard of," Dr. Reynolds explained gently. "Sometimes adult-onset mental illness manifests suddenly and severely, especially when triggered by stress or underlying conditions. But Marcus has never had any psychological problems," I protested. "He's always been the most stable of my children. Mental illness doesn't always follow predictable patterns. Your son's wife has been documenting concerning behaviors for months. She's been trying to get him help, but he's been resistant to treatment. Yesterday's incident forced our hand. I wanted to see Marcus, to hear his side of the story, but I was told he'd been sedated for his own safety and wouldn't be coherent for several hours." Stephanie appeared in the waiting room, her eyes red from crying, and her arms bandaged where Marcus had apparently scratched her during their struggle. "Patricia, thank God you're here," she said, throwing her arms around me in a desperate hug. "I didn't know what else to do. I've been trying to protect him and get him help, but he's gotten so much worse. The doctor says he needs to be hospitalized for at least 30 days, maybe longer." Looking at this woman who was sobbing in my arms, showing me physical evidence of my son's violence, I felt my world tilt on its axis. Everything I thought I knew about Marcus, about our relationship, about the man I'd raised, suddenly seemed unreliable. If my youngest child could become someone capable of threatening his wife with a knife, what else had I missed or misunderstood? That night, I sat in my apartment staring at photos of Marcus from childhood through adulthood, searching for signs of the mental illness that had apparently been building for years. Had I been blind to his struggles? Had my protective instincts as a mother prevented me from seeing his psychological problems clearly? Had my dislike of Stephanie colored my judgment about their relationship and his needs? For the first time since Marcus brought Stephanie home, I wondered if I'd been the problem all along. Maybe she hadn't been trying to separate us. Maybe she'd been trying to protect him from a mother who refused to acknowledge her son's deteriorating mental health. Maybe my resistance to her influence had actually prevented Marcus from getting help he desperately needed. The doubt ate at me like acid, destroying my confidence in my own perceptions and memories. If I'd been wrong about Marcus, what else had I been wrong about? If my maternal instincts were so faulty that I'd missed my son's descent into mental illness, could I trust anything I thought I knew? What I didn't realize was that my doubt and self-blame were exactly what Stephanie had been cultivating for 3 years. What I couldn't see was that every phone call, every interaction, every crisis had been carefully orchestrated to bring me to this exact moment of complete uncertainty about my own judgment. The dangerous woman in this story wasn't my son. It was the woman who had convinced everyone, including me, that he was the threat while she systematically destroyed his health, his relationships, and his life for reasons I was only beginning to understand. But the truth has a way of surfacing, even when it's buried under layers of manipulation and lies. And sometimes, the very methods used to hide that truth become the tools that expose it. Stephanie's greatest mistake was underestimating how much people who truly love someone will fight to save them, even when everything seems hopeless. Marcus was released from the psychiatric hospital after 72 hours with a diagnosis of acute stress disorder and a prescription for antipsychotic medication. When I went to pick him up, Stephanie was already there, talking quietly with Dr. Reynolds about outpatient treatment options and safety protocols for the home environment. My son looked like a ghost of himself. He'd lost at least 15 pounds during his brief stay, and his skin had a waxy pallor that made him look decades older than his 47 years. When he saw me, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Relief, maybe, or desperation. But Stephanie quickly stepped between us. "Marcus, honey, remember what Dr. Reynolds said about keeping stress levels low during your adjustment period?" she said gently, taking his arm. "Maybe we should limit visits for the first few weeks while you get used to your new medication." Dr. Reynolds nodded approvingly. "Family support is crucial, but we want to avoid overwhelming situations that might trigger another episode. Mrs. Harrison has been very responsible about understanding your son's needs." The casual way he referred to Stephanie as Mrs. Harrison, using Marcus's last name with such authority, made something cold settle in my stomach. She'd positioned herself as the responsible caregiver, while I was relegated to the role of potentially triggering family member. During the drive to their house, I followed behind Stephanie's luxury SUV, another expensive purchase that seemed inconsistent with their supposed financial situation. Marcus sat in the passenger seat like a prisoner, staring straight ahead without acknowledging my presence in his rearview mirror. At the house, Stephanie had prepared what she called a recovery environment. She'd removed all the knives from the kitchen, installed locks on several interior doors, and set up a medication station in the dining room with pill organizers and scheduling charts. Everything was designed to reinforce the narrative that Marcus was dangerously unstable and required constant monitoring. "Patricia, I know this is hard to see," Stephanie said as she showed me the safety measures. But the doctor was very clear about the risk factors. Marcus doesn't remember the knife incident, which is actually common with psychotic episodes. We have to be prepared for the possibility that it could happen again. Marcus sat at the kitchen table throughout this conversation, saying nothing. When I tried to make eye contact with him, his gaze slid away like he couldn't bear to look at me directly. This wasn't the behavior of someone recovering from a mental health crisis. This was the behavior of someone who'd been systematically broken down. "Marcus, how are you feeling?" I asked directly, ignoring Stephanie's obvious disapproval of my question. "Confused," he said quietly. "The medication makes everything feel fuzzy. I can't remember a lot of things that supposedly happened." He looked at Stephanie with an expression I couldn't interpret. Stephanie has to remind me about conversations we've had and things I've done. "Memory issues are completely normal," Stephanie said quickly. The doctor explained that trauma can cause gaps in recollection. That's why it's important that Marcus has someone reliable to help him navigate his recovery. Something about her tone, the way she immediately jumped in to provide context for every statement Marcus made, reminded me of the way certain teachers had spoken about struggling students during my years volunteering at the elementary school. They were always quick to explain away inconsistencies or confusion, but never willing to consider that their own methods might be contributing to the problems. Over the following weeks, I tried to maintain contact with Marcus, despite Stephanie's increasingly creative obstacles. She scheduled his therapy appointments during times when I was traditionally available to visit. She claimed he was too tired for phone calls after his medication adjustments. She suggested that my presence seemed to agitate him, though I saw no evidence of this during our brief interactions. The few times I did speak with Marcus alone, usually when Stephanie was at work or running errands, he seemed more like himself. His speech was clearer, his thoughts more organized, and he asked genuine questions about the family and my life. But these moments were rare, and always cut short by Stephanie's return. Patricia, the doctor, specifically said Marcus needs consistent routine during his recovery. She'd say when she found us talking, unexpected visits can disrupt his progress. She'd say it with such professional authority that I found myself apologizing for caring about my son's well-being. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an 80-year-old retired nurse who lived in the apartment next to mine, knocked on my door one evening with a concerned expression. "Patricia, I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but I've noticed some unusual activity at your son's house," she said carefully. "I was visiting my granddaughter who lives on Maple Ridge Road, and I've seen some strange comings and goings." Mrs. Chen explained that she'd been walking past Marcus and Stephanie's house several times over the past month during her evening walks with her granddaughter's dog. On 3 separate occasions, she'd seen unfamiliar cars parked in their driveway late at night, always expensive vehicles that stayed for only 20 or 30 minutes before leaving. "The strangest thing," Mrs. Chen continued, "was that I saw your son in the yard one night around 11 o'clock. He was in his bathrobe, and he looked like he was searching for something in the bushes near their front porch. When a car pulled up, he seemed startled and went back inside quickly." This information didn't fit with Stephanie's portrayal of Marcus as heavily sedated and closely monitored. If he was as unstable and medicated as she claimed, he wouldn't be outside alone at night, and there certainly wouldn't be mysterious visitors coming and going. I thanked Mrs. Chen for her concern and spent the rest of the evening trying to make sense of what she'd observed. The expensive cars suggested drug activity, but I couldn't imagine Marcus being involved in anything illegal. He'd always been almost painfully honest, the kind of person who returned extra change at stores and reported income accurately on his taxes. But what if Marcus wasn't involved voluntarily? What if the mysterious visitors were connected to Stephanie's unexplained wealth, and Marcus was somehow being used without his knowledge or consent? The next morning, I decided to drive by their house during what Stephanie had told me was Marcus's usual therapy appointment time. If he was really receiving professional treatment, the house should be empty. Instead, I found Marcus working in their backyard garden, moving slowly but appearing relatively alert and oriented. I parked down the street and watched him for 20 minutes. He was clearly functional, tending to plants and moving around the yard without the confusion or instability Stephanie described. When a black sedan pulled into the driveway, I expected to see Stephanie returning from wherever she'd gone. Instead, a man in his 30s got out, spoke briefly with Marcus through the back gate, and handed him what looked like a small package before leaving. The entire interaction lasted less than 5 minutes, but it confirmed that something was happening at that house that had nothing to do with mental health treatment. Marcus was alert enough to conduct business with strangers, which contradicted everything Stephanie had told doctors and family members about his condition. That afternoon, I called my daughter Sarah in Boston. As a social worker specializing in elder abuse cases, she had experience with situations where family members were manipulated or exploited by people they trusted. "Mom, everything you're describing sounds like classic financial abuse patterns," Sarah said after I explained my concerns. "The isolation, the medical explanations for behavior changes, the control over access to the victim. Have you been able to verify Marcus's actual medical treatment?" I realized I hadn't. I'd taken Stephanie's word about doctors, medications, and treatment plans without ever speaking to Marcus's healthcare providers directly. She says patient privacy laws prevent them from talking to family members. That's only partially true, Sarah explained. Marcus can authorize providers to speak with you if he chooses to. The fact that Stephanie is discouraging direct communication with his doctors is a red flag. And Mom, the expensive house and cars you've mentioned? Financial abuse often involves using the victim's credit or assets to fund the abuser's lifestyle. Sarah offered to drive up from Boston that weekend to help me investigate further. She had contacts in law enforcement and social services, who might be able to provide guidance about how to approach the situation legally. Friday evening, Sarah arrived with her husband Jim and a folder full of information about financial abuse, medication manipulation, and legal resources. We spent hours going through everything I'd observed over the past few months, looking for patterns and evidence. "Mom, I think Marcus might be being drugged," Sarah said grimly. "The symptoms you've described, the memory problems, the physical deterioration, the personality changes, they're all consistent with certain types of medication abuse. If Stephanie is controlling his prescriptions and possibly giving him additional substances, she could be keeping him in a vulnerable state." The idea was so horrifying I could barely process it. The thought that someone was systematically poisoning my son while convincing everyone, including me, that his resulting symptoms were mental illness was almost too evil to comprehend. But the doctors at the hospital confirmed his condition. I protested weakly. "Based on what information?" Jim asked. He worked as a paralegal and understood how easily medical records could be manipulated. If Stephanie was the primary source of information about Marcus's history and symptoms, and if she presented physical evidence like scratches or defensive wounds, doctors would have no reason to question her account. We developed a plan for Saturday. While Sarah and Jim conducted surveillance of the house, I would attempt to have a private conversation with Marcus to assess his actual mental state and try to learn more about his daily routine and medication regimen. Saturday morning brought unseasonably warm weather for October in Vermont. I called Stephanie and asked if I could take Marcus for a walk around their neighborhood, suggesting that fresh air and light exercise might be beneficial for his recovery. Stephanie hesitated for a long moment before agreeing. "I suppose a short walk would be okay. But Patricia, please don't ask him a lot of questions about his condition or treatment." The doctor said rehashing traumatic events can trigger setbacks. When I arrived at the house, Marcus was waiting on the front porch, dressed in jeans and a sweater that hung loosely on his diminished frame. He looked tired but more alert than I'd seen him in weeks. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly, giving me a brief hug. "It's nice to see you." His voice was clearer than it had been during our recent interactions, and his eyes seemed more focused. We walked slowly down Maple Ridge Road, past the expensive homes and manicured lawns that characterize this upscale neighborhood. For the first few minutes, Marcus seemed nervous, glancing back toward the house and checking his watch repeatedly. "Sweetheart, are you worried about something?" I asked gently. "Stephanie likes to know where I am," he said carefully. "She gets anxious if I'm gone too long or if she can't reach me." He showed me his phone, which had location tracking enabled and multiple missed calls from Stephanie even though we'd been walking for only 10 minutes. "Marcus, can I ask you something honestly? How are you really feeling? Not what the doctors say or what Stephanie thinks, but how you actually feel day to day." He was quiet for a long time, and I could see him struggling with how to answer. "I feel like I'm living in a fog," he finally said. "Everything is muted and distant. I can't think clearly or remember things I should remember. But, Mom, the weird thing is, I feel better when Stephanie's not around. Like right now talking to you, I feel more like myself than I have in months." This admission confirmed my worst fears. "When did you start feeling this way? Can you remember when the fog began?" "It's been gradual. Maybe since we moved into the new house." Stephanie said it was stress from the mortgage and adjusting to married life. Then after I had what she called my breakdown, the doctor started me on medication that made everything worse. "Marcus, what do you remember about the knife incident? The one where you supposedly threatened Stephanie?" He stopped walking entirely and stared at me with genuine confusion. "That's the thing, Mom. I don't remember it at all. I remember arguing with Stephanie about money, about why we had expensive things I couldn't remember buying. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in the hospital with doctors telling me I'd had a psychotic episode." My heart was racing as pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. What kind of argument about money? I found credit card statements showing purchases I didn't recognize. Designer clothes, jewelry, expensive dinners at restaurants we'd never been to. When I asked Stephanie about them, she said I'd been having memory problems and had forgotten making the purchases myself. But Mom, I would never spend money like that. You know how careful I've always been. The financial abuse Sarah had mentioned was becoming clearer. Stephanie was using Marcus's credit and accounts to fund a lifestyle far beyond their legitimate means, then gaslighting him about his own spending when he questioned the discrepancies. Did you ever see the actual credit cards or statements again after that conversation? No, Stephanie took control of all our finances after my hospitalization. She said the doctor recommended it because financial stress had triggered my breakdown. Now she handles everything and just gives me a small allowance for personal expenses. We had reached the end of the neighborhood and were walking back toward the house when Marcus suddenly grabbed my arm. Mom, can I tell you something that might sound crazy? Of course, sweetheart. Sometimes I find pills in my food. Like, I'll be eating something Stephanie made, and I'll bite down on something hard that tastes metallic. When I ask her about it, she says I'm imagining things, or that it might be a vitamin that broke apart during cooking. But it happens too often to be accidental. The horror of what he was describing hit me like a physical blow. Stephanie wasn't just controlling Marcus's prescribed medication. She was secretly drugging his food to maintain the cognitive impairment that made him manageable and unable to question her actions effectively. Marcus, have you told anyone else about finding pills in your food? I mentioned it to the therapist once, but Stephanie was in the session with me, and she explained it as part of my paranoia and delusional thinking. The therapist agreed that suspicious thoughts about being poisoned were consistent with my diagnosis. Of course, Stephanie attended his therapy sessions. It ensured she could control the narrative and prevent Marcus from revealing information that might expose her manipulation. As we approached the house, I could see Stephanie watching from the front window. Marcus's posture immediately changed, becoming more hunched and uncertain, like a child expecting punishment. Mom, please don't tell Stephanie what I said about the pills, he whispered urgently. She gets really upset when I talk about paranoid thoughts, and the doctor said it could make my condition worse if people encourage my delusions. The fact that Marcus had been conditioned to view his own accurate perceptions as symptoms of mental illness was perhaps the most insidious aspect of Stephanie's manipulation. She'd created a situation where any attempt by Marcus to identify or report her abuse would be dismissed as evidence of his psychiatric instability. Stephanie met us at the front door with a concerned expression. How was your walk? Marcus, you look a little flushed. Maybe you overdid it. She felt his forehead like a mother checking a child for fever. I feel fine, Marcus said, but his voice had already become flat and distant again. Why don't you go inside and rest while I talk to your mother for a minute? Stephanie suggested with gentle authority. Marcus complied immediately, disappearing into the house like a well-trained patient. Patricia, I hope Marcus didn't say anything to worry you, Stephanie said once we were alone. He's been having some paranoid episodes lately, where he imagines things that haven't happened. The doctor says it's part of his condition, but it can be distressing for family members to hear. She was already working to undermine anything Marcus might have told me, preemptively explaining away his revelations as symptoms rather than truth. If I hadn't been specifically looking for manipulation tactics, I might have accepted her explanation and dismissed my son's concerns about being drugged. He seemed pretty coherent during our walk, I said carefully. That's actually concerning, Stephanie replied with practiced worry. The doctor said that periods of apparent clarity can be followed by more severe episodes. I should probably call his psychiatrist and report that Marcus seemed unusually talkative and energetic today. Even Marcus's improvement was being reframed as evidence of instability. Stephanie had created a perfect trap where any positive change in his condition became reason for increased medication and closer monitoring. After I left, I drove straight to Sarah and Jim's surveillance location 3 blocks away. They'd been monitoring the house with binoculars and had observed several interesting developments during my visit with Marcus. Mom, 20 minutes after you started your walk, Stephanie left the house in her car, Sarah reported. She drove to a pharmacy across town, went inside for about 10 minutes, then returned home right before you and Marcus got back. Did you see what she purchased? No, but the timing suggests she was picking up something related to Marcus's medication or condition, Jim got the license plate of a car that visited while you were gone. Jim showed me photos he'd taken of a silver Mercedes that had pulled into the driveway during my walk with Marcus. A well-dressed woman in her 50s had gone to the front door, stayed for approximately 5 minutes, then left quickly. The car is registered to Dr. Amanda Foster, Jim said, reading from his phone. She's a psychiatrist with a practice downtown, but here's the interesting part. She's not affiliated with Burlington General Hospital where Marcus was treated. This meant Stephanie was consulting with medical professionals outside of Marcus's official treatment team. Whether Dr. Foster was providing legitimate services or was somehow complicit in the abuse, her secret visit suggested medical care that wasn't being documented through proper channels. Sarah had also researched Stephanie's background more thoroughly and discovered several troubling inconsistencies. Mom, Stephanie's employment history doesn't match what she's told the family. The retail store where she supposedly works as a manager has no record of employing anyone by her name or matching her description. This explained how Stephanie could afford their expensive lifestyle while supposedly working part-time retail. If she wasn't actually employed, her income was coming from other sources, most likely Marcus's business accounts and credit lines. There's more, Sarah continued. I ran a background check and found records showing Stephanie was previously married twice. Both marriages ended in divorce after less than 3 years. And both ex-husbands filed restraining orders alleging financial abuse and emotional manipulation. The pattern was clear. Stephanie was a predator who targeted vulnerable men, established control through isolation and manipulation, then systematically stole their assets while making them appear unstable or incompetent. We need to involve law enforcement, Jim said firmly. Marcus is being held against his will through chemical restraint and financial coercion. This constitutes kidnapping and elder abuse under Vermont law. But involving police would be complicated. Stephanie had created extensive documentation of Marcus's supposed mental illness, complete with medical records and witness statements. Without hard evidence of drugging or financial fraud, authorities might view the situation as a family dispute rather than criminal abuse. We need proof, Sarah said. Something that definitively shows Marcus is being drugged, or that Stephanie is stealing his money. I remembered Marcus mentioning finding pills in his food, and had an idea. What if we could get samples of his meals and have them tested for drugs? That could work, Jim agreed, but we'd need to collect the food without Stephanie knowing, and we'd need to do it when we're certain she's added something to it. We developed a plan for the following week. I would invite Marcus and Stephanie to dinner at my apartment, suggesting it would be easier for Marcus than going out to a restaurant. During the meal, I would create opportunities to collect samples of any food Stephanie might have tampered with before serving. The dinner invitation was met with the expected resistance from Stephanie. She claimed Marcus was too fragile for social situations, and that changes in routine could trigger psychiatric episodes. But when I mentioned that my other children would be joining us via video call to check on Marcus, she seemed to realize that refusing completely would raise suspicions. I suppose a quiet family dinner might be beneficial, she conceded, but we'll need to leave early if Marcus becomes overwhelmed or agitated. Tuesday evening arrived with unseasonable snow for early November. Stephanie and Marcus arrived at my apartment at 6 o'clock, with Stephanie carrying what she described as Marcus's evening medications and a thermos of herbal tea that she claimed helped with his anxiety. The doctor suggested this specific blend. She explained while setting up a medication station on my kitchen counter. It's important that Marcus have it with dinner to prevent mood fluctuations. I served a simple meal of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, foods that Marcus had always enjoyed. Throughout dinner, Stephanie monitored every bite he took and frequently encouraged him to drink the herbal tea. During our video call with Sarah, David, and Jennifer, Marcus seemed more animated than he had in months. He asked questions about their children and work, and even laughed at David's stories about restaurant customers. But I noticed that whenever he became more engaged in conversation, Stephanie would suggest he drink more of his tea. About an hour into dinner, Marcus excused himself to use the bathroom. While he was gone, I watched Stephanie carefully pour something from a small vial into his remaining tea. The powder dissolved quickly, leaving no visible trace. When Marcus returned, Stephanie immediately encouraged him to finish his tea before it got cold. Within 20 minutes of consuming it, his speech became slurred and his eyelids began drooping. "I think the social stimulation might be too much," Stephanie said with concern. "Marcus, you're looking very tired. Maybe we should head home so you can rest." I managed to collect samples of Marcus's remaining tea and a portion of the powder Stephanie had spilled on my counter while pouring it into his cup. After they left, with Marcus barely able to walk steadily to the car, I sealed the samples in clean containers and refrigerated them. The next morning, Sarah arranged for the samples to be analyzed at a private laboratory in Burlington. The results came back 2 days later and confirmed our worst suspicions. The tea contained high concentrations of lorazepam, quetiapine, and diphenhydramine, a cocktail of sedatives and antipsychotics that would cause exactly the symptoms Marcus had been experiencing: confusion, memory loss, physical weakness, and cognitive impairment. "Mom, this is enough to kill someone if the dosages were increased," Sarah said grimly. "Stephanie isn't just keeping Marcus compliant, she's slowly poisoning him." Armed with laboratory evidence of drugging, we contacted Detective Maria Santos of the Burlington Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Detective Santos had experience with elder abuse cases and understood the complex dynamics of domestic manipulation. "The drug evidence is compelling," quote, Detective Santos said after reviewing our documentation. "But we'll need additional evidence to build a case that will stand up in court. Financial records, communications, medical records that show discrepancies with his actual treatment." She explained that the investigation would need to be conducted carefully to avoid alerting Stephanie to law enforcement interest. If Stephanie realized she was under suspicion, she might escalate her abuse of Marcus or destroy evidence of financial fraud. "We're going to set up surveillance of the residence and monitor communications," Detective Santos explained. "In the meantime, try to maintain normal contact with your son without raising Stephanie's suspicions. Document everything, but don't confront her directly." Over the following week, police surveillance revealed a pattern of activity that supported our concerns about Stephanie's illegal behavior. Multiple visitors came to the house at unusual hours, staying for brief periods and leaving quickly. Phone records showed frequent communication between Stephanie and individuals with known connections to prescription drug trafficking. Most importantly, financial investigators discovered that Stephanie had opened credit lines and bank accounts in Marcus's name without his knowledge or consent. She'd been systematically transferring money from Marcus's business accounts to personal accounts she controlled, then using those funds to make purchases that supported her expensive lifestyle. The investigation culminated on a Thursday morning when police executed a search warrant for Marcus and Stephanie's home. I wasn't present for the raid, but Detective Santos called me afterward with an update. "Patricia, we found everything we needed to prove your son was being abused," she said. Stephanie had a substantial supply of unprescribed medications hidden in her closet, along with detailed notes about dosages and effects she was monitoring. We also found forged documents, stolen financial information, and communication records showing she was selling some of the drugs she wasn't using on Marcus. Marcus was taken to Burlington General Hospital for medical evaluation and detoxification from the substances he'd been unknowingly consuming for months. Stephanie was arrested on charges including assault, financial fraud, illegal drug possession with intent to distribute, and elder abuse. When I arrived at the hospital, Marcus was awake and alert for the first time in almost a year. The fog that had clouded his thinking was beginning to lift as the drugs cleared from his system. "Mom," he said when he saw me, tears streaming down his face. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't trust my own thoughts. She convinced everyone, including me, that I was losing my mind. The road to recovery would be long. Marcus faced months of medical treatment to address the physical damage from chronic drugging, therapy to process the psychological trauma of sustained abuse, and legal proceedings to recover his stolen assets and ensure Stephanie faced appropriate consequences for her crimes. But as I sat beside his hospital bed, watching my son reclaim his identity and his voice, I knew that the nightmare was finally over. The truth had a power that no amount of manipulation could ultimately overcome. The preliminary hearing for Stephanie's case took place 6 weeks after her arrest, on a frigid December morning in Burlington. I sat in the courthouse gallery beside Sarah, David, and Jennifer, watching as the woman who had nearly destroyed my son was led into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit and shackles. Stephanie looked dramatically different from the polished, confident woman who had manipulated our family for 3 years. Her platinum hair had grown out, revealing dark roots, and without her expensive makeup and designer clothes, she appeared older and harder. But what struck me most was her demeanor. Even in custody, she maintained an air of defiance, like she believed she could talk her way out of the charges. Marcus testified via video link from a secure location, as his doctors felt he wasn't ready for the stress of appearing in person. Watching my son describe months of systematic poisoning and financial theft was heartbreaking, but his voice was clear and steady. The fog that had clouded his thinking for so long was completely gone. "She would dissolve pills in my coffee every morning," Marcus explained to the prosecutor. "When I started noticing a bitter taste, she switched to putting them in foods with strong flavors like tomato sauce or chocolate desserts. If I questioned feeling drowsy or confused, she'd remind me about my mental health diagnosis and suggest I needed to increase my medication." The evidence against Stephanie was overwhelming. Police had found over 200 pills of various controlled substances hidden throughout the house, along with detailed journals documenting Marcus's reactions to different drug combinations. Her handwriting filled notebook after notebook with observations like increased dosage causing more compliance, and financial transfers completed without resistance. Most damning was her communication with Dr. Amanda Foster, the psychiatrist who had been making house calls. Text messages revealed that Dr. Foster had been providing unprescribed medications and falsified medical records to support Stephanie's narrative about Marcus's mental illness. In exchange, Stephanie was paying Dr. Foster $5,000 monthly and sharing some of the drugs for her own illegal distribution network. During cross-examination, Stephanie's defense attorney tried to portray her as a devoted wife overwhelmed by her husband's genuine mental health crisis. "My client was trying to help a man she loved who was becoming increasingly unstable and dangerous," the lawyer argued. Any medications found in the home were prescribed by licensed medical professionals. But the prosecutor dismantled this defense systematically. Bank records showed that Stephanie had stolen over $150,000 from Marcus's business accounts and personal savings. Security footage from pharmacies captured her purchasing pills with forged prescriptions. Most convincingly, medical experts testified that the drug combinations found in Marcus's system would have been lethal if continued much longer. The defendant wasn't helping her husband, the prosecutor stated firmly. She was slowly killing him while stealing everything he'd worked for. This was a calculated plan that spanned years, not the desperate actions of a concerned spouse. The judge denied Stephanie's request for bail, ruling that she posed a flight risk and a danger to the community. As she was led back to her holding cell, Stephanie turned toward our family section with a look of pure hatred. For just a moment, the mask slipped completely, and I saw the cold, calculating predator who had targeted my son. Dr. Amanda Foster was arrested 3 days later at her private practice. Police found evidence that she'd been running a prescription drug mill, providing illegal medications to multiple clients, including Stephanie. Her medical license was immediately suspended, and she faced charges of drug trafficking, medical fraud, and conspiracy. During Foster's interrogation, she revealed details about Stephanie's operation that shocked even experienced investigators. Stephanie hadn't just been abusing Marcus. She'd been part of a larger network selling diverted pharmaceuticals to addicts and dealers throughout Vermont and New Hampshire. Stephanie recruited vulnerable men through online dating sites. Detective Santos explained to our family during an update meeting. She'd target recently divorced or widowed men with assets, then use the same pattern of isolation, drugging, and financial theft. Marcus was her third victim that we know of. The investigation expanded to include Stephanie's previous relationships. Police contacted her 2 ex-husbands, both of whom had suspected they were being drugged but couldn't prove it. One had lost his house and business before managing to escape the relationship. The other had suffered a heart attack that doctors now believed was caused by medication tampering. "She's a serial predator," Detective Santos continued. "Marcus was lucky you intervened when you did." Based on the drug levels we found in his system and the escalating dosages in her journals, she was probably planning to kill him within the next few months and claim it was suicide related to his mental illness. The thought that I'd come so close to losing my son forever made me physically sick. If Mrs. Chen hadn't noticed the suspicious activity, if Sarah hadn't recognized the signs of abuse, if we hadn't acted when we did, Marcus would have died, and everyone would have blamed his supposed psychiatric condition. Marcus's recovery was slower and more complicated than any of us had expected. The chronic drugging had caused significant physical damage, including liver problems, memory issues, and neurological symptoms that required months of medical treatment. More challenging was the psychological trauma of realizing how completely he'd been manipulated and controlled. "I keep questioning everything I remember from the last 3 years," he told me during one of our daily phone calls. "Did I really love her, or was that just the drugs talking? How could I have been so blind to what she was doing? What kind of man lets someone poison him for months without figuring it out?" I reminded him that Stephanie was a skilled manipulator who had fooled medical professionals, law enforcement, and our entire family. "Sweetheart, you were a victim, not a fool. She chose you specifically because you're trusting and kind. Those aren't weaknesses, they're the qualities that make you who you are." The financial recovery was equally complex. Stephanie had hidden stolen money in accounts across multiple states, some of which she'd already spent on luxury items or given to accomplices. Federal investigators worked to trace and recover Marcus's assets, but the process would take years and wouldn't recover everything. Marcus had money to close his electrical business temporarily while dealing with the legal and medical aftermath of Stephanie's abuse. His reputation in the community had suffered because of rumors about his supposed mental illness and violent behavior. Even though the truth was now public, some people continued to view him with suspicion. "It's going to take time for people to understand what really happened," Sarah reminded us during one family meeting. "The important thing is that Marcus is alive and recovering. Everything else can be rebuilt." Slowly, Marcus began reconnecting with friends and family members who had been excluded from his life during Stephanie's reign of control. His brothers-in-law offered him work with their businesses, while he decided whether to restart his electrical company. His nieces and nephews, who had been kept away during his supposed dangerous episodes, were thrilled to have their uncle back. Most importantly, Marcus and I began rebuilding our relationship. We started having weekly dinners again, talking openly about the 3 years we'd lost and the warning signs we'd both missed. The conversations were sometimes painful, but they were honest in a way that our interactions hadn't been since Stephanie entered the picture. "Mom, I owe you an apology," Marcus said during one particularly emotional dinner. "Stephanie convinced me that you were jealous and controlling, that you couldn't accept my happiness. I believed her instead of trusting my own knowledge of who you are." "You don't owe me any apology," I replied firmly. "She isolated you from everyone who loved you and then convinced you it was your choice. That's what abusers do. They make their victims complicit in their own destruction." The trial began in March, 8 months after Stephanie's arrest. Media attention was intense, as the case had attracted national interest due to its unusual circumstances and the extent of Stephanie's criminal network. Reporters called it one of the most sophisticated domestic abuse and financial fraud cases in Vermont history. Stephanie maintained her innocence throughout the proceedings, claiming she was the real victim of a conspiracy by Marcus's family to destroy her marriage. Her testimony was rambling and contradictory, filled with accusations that we had planted evidence and bribed witnesses. "Patricia Williams never accepted me," Stephanie declared from the witness stand. "She poisoned her son against me from day one and created this elaborate fiction to break us up. Everything I did was to protect Marcus from his toxic family relationships. But the evidence was too overwhelming for her denials to have any impact." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: aggravated assault, financial fraud, illegal drug distribution, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit murder. During the sentencing hearing, Marcus finally appeared in person to deliver a victim impact statement. He'd gained back most of the weight he'd lost and looked healthy for the first time in years. His voice was strong as he addressed the court and Stephanie directly. "For 3 years you convinced me that I was losing my mind," he said, looking straight at Stephanie. "You made me doubt my own memories, my own perceptions, my own worth as a human being. You isolated me from everyone who loved me and then told me it was for my own good. You were slowly killing me while pretending to care for me." He paused, collecting himself before continuing. "But the worst part wasn't what you did to me. It was what you did to my family. You made my mother watch her son disappear, made my siblings believe I didn't want them in my life anymore. You stole 3 years of relationships that can never be completely recovered." Stephanie showed no emotion during Marcus's statement, staring straight ahead like she was listening to a weather report. Even faced with the consequences of her actions, she seemed incapable of genuine remorse or acknowledgement of the harm she'd caused. The judge sentenced Stephanie to 25 years in prison without possibility of parole for 15 years. Dr. Amanda Foster received 12 years for her role in the conspiracy. Several other accomplices in their drug distribution network received sentences ranging from 3 to 8 years. This court has rarely seen such a calculated and prolonged campaign of abuse, the judge stated during sentencing. The defendant showed a complete lack of empathy for her victim, while systematically destroying his health, his finances, and his family relationships. The sentence reflects not only the severity of these crimes, but the need to protect society from someone capable of such sustained deception and cruelty. As Stephanie was led away to begin her sentence, she finally looked toward our family section. But instead of the hatred I'd seen during previous court appearances, her expression was blank and empty, like she'd already moved on to planning her next manipulation. A year later, Marcus had fully recovered his health and reopened his electrical business under a new name. The community support surprised him. Many people who had heard about the case went out of their way to hire him and recommend his services to others. His reputation was not only restored but enhanced by his survival story. We resumed our weekly dinners, but they were different now. Deeper, more honest, more appreciative of the time we had together. Marcus was more cautious about relationships, which concerned me, but he was also more confident in his own judgment and less likely to ignore warning signs. "I learned that trusting people doesn't mean surrendering your critical thinking," he told me during one of our conversations. Stephanie taught me the difference between love and control, even if that wasn't her intention. My other children commented on how much stronger our family had become through the crisis. David said the experience had taught him to pay closer attention to subtle changes in family dynamics. Jennifer started volunteering with domestic abuse organizations, using her professional skills as a counselor to help other families recognize manipulation tactics. Sarah continued working in elder abuse prevention, but now specialized in cases involving family-by-marriage perpetrators. "Mom, what happened to Marcus is more common than people realize," she explained. "Adult children's spouses are often perfectly positioned to isolate and abuse elderly or vulnerable family members. Your story is helping other families recognize the warning signs. Looking back now, I can see the red flags that I missed or dismissed during Stephanie's campaign to control Marcus. The expensive lifestyle that didn't match her supposed income. The way she answered questions for him or redirected conversations when he started sharing personal information. The gradual erosion of his independence and decision-making authority. The medical explanations that always seemed to require more medication rather than less. Most importantly, I learned to trust my instincts about people, even when they present compelling evidence that my concerns are unfounded." Stephanie was skilled at making her abuse look like care, her control look like love, and her victim's resistance look like mental illness. But underneath the professional presentations and medical terminology, my gut knew something was wrong. The experience changed how I view family relationships and the vulnerability that comes with trusting someone completely. Marcus wasn't weak or stupid for falling victim to Stephanie's manipulation. He was targeted specifically because he was kind, generous, and loyal. Those qualities made him both attractive to a predator and susceptible to her methods. Today, Marcus is engaged to a wonderful woman named Lisa, who works as a physical therapist. She's patient with his caution about relationships and understanding about the family dynamics that resulted from his previous experience. Most importantly, she encourages his independence and his relationships with family members, rather than trying to control or limit them. The difference is obvious. Marcus told me recently, "Lisa wants to be part of my life, not replace it entirely. She asks questions about you and my siblings because she's genuinely interested, not because she's looking for ways to use the information against me." 3 years after Stephanie's conviction, Marcus and Lisa were married in a small ceremony at my apartment, surrounded by family and close friends. It was the opposite of his first wedding, intimate and warm, rather than elaborate and performative. Lisa's parents embraced our family immediately, understanding that we'd been through something traumatic together and had emerged stronger. During the reception, Marcus pulled me aside for a private moment. "Mom, thank you for never giving up on me," he said. "Even when I pushed you away, even when everyone, including me, believed I was dangerous, you kept fighting for the truth. I wouldn't be here without your stubbornness." "I'm your mother," I replied simply. "That's what mothers do. We protect our children, even when they're adults, even when they don't think they need protection, even when protecting them costs us everything." Now, at 71, I'm more grateful than ever for the family relationships I once took for granted. Weekly dinners with Marcus and Lisa, video calls with my other children, visits with grandchildren who know their uncle's real story rather than Stephanie's manufactured version. These connections feel precious in a way they never did before I almost lost them. I still think about Stephanie sometimes, wondering if she's learned anything from her conviction, or if she's simply planning her next manipulation from prison. But mostly I focus on the life she tried to destroy and failed to take away from us. The real victory wasn't her conviction, or even Marcus's recovery. It was the realization that love is stronger than manipulation, that truth is more powerful than lies, and that families who fight for each other can survive even the most sophisticated attempts to tear them apart. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who present themselves as caregivers, who use medical terminology to explain away abuse, who convince everyone, including their victims, that their control is actually protection. But if we stay alert, trust our instincts, and refuse to let manipulation masquerade as love, we can protect the people we care about from those who would harm them. That's a lesson worth more than all the money Stephanie stole, more valuable than the 3 years she cost us, and more important than the pain she caused. Because in the end, she didn't win. Love did. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.